Neil Jones from Possible, who will present the project Powering Parks.
Thanks, Camilla. Yeah, I'm Neil from the climate change charity Possible. We've been working in partnership with Scene, who are a social enterprise working with communities to build renewable energy systems, and also Hackney Council, who have lots of parks. Over the past 2 years, we've been investigating installing heat pumps in parks to provide low carbon heat to nearby buildings. And that's been with the aim of tackling climate change, but also improving air quality and hopefully also generating a little bit of income that the local authority can then reinvest locally. We started with a study of all the parks and green spaces in the borough, and Bruce will take you through this in detail in a bit shortly. We also released a report on the national potential for park heat, and finally we've created a replication toolkit. I'm going to tell you a bit more about these last two, but first, for those of you that don't already know, I'll tell you a little bit more about the technology. So on screen at the moment, you can see a very basic setup for a ground source heat pump system. What happens first is that the sun warms up the ground or the water, so we're talking about ambient heat here, not geothermal. A heat pump then takes this heat, concentrates it, and then pumps it into the buildings where we can use it to heat either space or water or both. And in the summer, we can even reverse that system to then keep the buildings cool. The ground array, which you can see at the bottom there, that collects the heat from below the surface of the park. And that can be either a horizontal or slinky system, or it can be a vertical system which uses a borehole, and that goes down between 100 and 200 meters. You can see at the top there, there's a white box, so that's basically the heat pump. And to the left, the heat distribution system, which is, basically that's just your radiators or the underfloor heating inside the building. So the heat pump itself, it works in more or less the same way as a fridge. Except instead of moving the warmth from the inside to the outside, it does the opposite. So we circulate a refrigerant around the sealed tubes of the system, and then a compressor in the heat pump changes the pressure of that refrigerant in different stages. So that turns it either into a gas or back to a liquid, and it absorbs or releases heat in the process of doing that. But the clever thing is that for every unit of electricity you use to run the heat pump, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 units of heat are produced. So that makes it super efficient. So this is the report that we released towards the end of 2019. So this was looking at the potential for heat from green spaces on a national scale. So we took data from Ordnance Survey, the British Geological Society, and Survey, and other sources to estimate the total ground source heat potential in parks, green spaces and playing fields in England, Scotland and Wales. Sadly, the data wasn't available for Northern Ireland, otherwise we would have included Northern Ireland too. So the total for GB is 30 gigawatts. That's about 10% of our total peak heat demand. And we broke down the results by local authority area too. So, so in the report, you can look up the potential for your own area too. And we found that the places with the most park heat potential in England are Richmond, and then those places that are on the outskirts of London, as well as Bristol, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, and Milton Keynes, all those roundabouts. And in Wales, it's the South Wales towns and cities that dominate. So Cardiff, Newport, Swansea, along with Caerphilly and the Rhondda, although Wrexham gets a look in too when playing fields are included. In Scotland, it's that central belt of Glasgow, North Lanarkshire and Edinburgh that have the most potential that we found. Do also check out the ParkPower project, which is a parallel research project by Greenspace Scotland. They have lots of really useful resources and case studies for Scotland on their website. And this is a screenshot of our replication toolkit. So all the learning from our Hackney project we've collected together and grouped into various modules, which we hope is accessible to local authorities, park authorities, councillors, hopefully even the general public as well, that you can find out all about heat pumps in there and more information on the kind of the financial side of things. That first module that you can see there is all about heat pumps. So that includes a video explainer of how they work in a park context. And there's also information about the subsidies that are available. Bruce will talk a bit more about this in a minute, but it's currently a bit of a difficult time on the subsidies front. Subsidies are currently needed because of the artificial high cost of electricity versus gas. But the current renewable heat incentive, the RHI, is coming to an end in March next year. And the non-domestic equivalent to replace that is yet to be announced by the government. But this is all explained in the toolkit, so you can find more information in there. That second module is the basis for action. So that's where you can find information to help you make the case for park heat projects in your organization. And it's also where you'll find the report that I was just talking about. Then further sections focus on searching for opportunities, assessing opportunities, estimating costs, and then the co-benefits. And then finally, there's an energy and financial modeling tool. And it's a really cool spreadsheet that you can put your own data into to estimate the energy and cost savings of a potential heat pump project. And that's against the direct electric, gas, or oil heating system equivalents. So it's a great tool that you can just play with, put your own data in and find out and get some results which will give you a basis for making your own feasibility assessments. On there is my email address, so please do get in touch if you either have any questions or if you have some feedback on the toolkit for us. Be very, very happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, now we will discuss the Hackney project, what you mentioned before during your presentation, with Bruce Irving. Here you go.
Thank you very much. My name is Bruce Irving. I'm the Parks Development Officer for the London Borough of Hackney. I thought I'd start with a picture of Kevin MacLeod. This is really just to sort of demonstrate my lack of knowledge, or my very low baseline of knowledge about ground source heat pumps when I started this project. As far as I was aware of them, really, it was something which people did in a field in Wales when they were building their house to sort of sort their underfloor heating out. So just to sort of set the scene, that's how we came into it. But luckily we partnered up with Scene and Possible, as they were 1010 back when we first joined up with them, in partnership. And I can't over stress how important it is, how important that partnership was to work together from a council perspective. It was really refreshing, and we really got some stuff done. So just a bit about London Borough of Hackney. We manage 58 parks and green spaces in the borough. We're an inner London borough. Here are just some of our examples of our spaces. We have CListo Park there in the centre, sort of a traditional Victorian park. But then we also manage places like Hackney Marshes in the top right there, which is the largest concentration of football pitches anywhere in Europe. And we have some more naturalistic sites with pictorial meadows, such as Hackney Downs in the bottom right. And then also Little London Square. So the two pictures in the sort of bottom left-hand corner and centre at the bottom is of Hoxton Square, with just a sort of new statue of Stick. So again, we're sort of looking at different kinds of spaces across our whole borough. So a few years ago, we decided to digitally map all our parks and green spaces with our GIS team. Now that not only allows us to create these rather sort of natty infographics, but the whole purpose of it really was to allow us to have an understanding of how we manage and maintain our space and think about how we can model that moving forwards. One of the spin-offs, as I said, is these infographics, which we sort of include in our annual reports, which we've done for the last few years and are available on our website, and they really summarise what we do in the borough. So if you want to find out more about us, go check them out. But as I said, this was really sort of the first stage, was sharing this data, these data sets of our parks with our colleagues at Scene, and then they took this information to help do the first assessment of where we could actually think about installing ground source heat pumps, where we actually had space to do it. Now, sort of simultaneously looking at where we had open green spaces, it was also at this point that we realised that we could use areas such as tennis courts or path networks, or areas of hard standing or car parks, or even water bodies. So while this was going on and they were looking at the opportunities there and the constraints, such as root protection areas, we also started to do an exercise about mapping our assets, our buildings, which we managed in the parks, and also looking at buildings surrounding our parks, which maybe didn't fit within our own management systems, such as local primary schools. So although they sit within the council, they're still sort of, they're not directly managed by the park service. So this led us to create a sort of long list of potential parks sites where we could have an asset where we could actually look at heating it, but then also looking where there's actually space in those green space to do that. But we needed a way to sort of pull that list down a bit, and so we went through and increased the matrix and ranked the different elements. So on here we've got asset ownership. So again, that sort of looked at the complications relating to that. So it scored really low, which was a good thing if it was indirectly in our parks management. So, you know, sort of park keepers, lodges, buildings, cafes within our own parks. And then things which were going to be more complicated, such as say a tower block next door to a green space, which had multiple leaseholders, would obviously be a very complicated project, and so that sort of got a higher score there. Most of these are fairly straightforward. Outreach, I'll just touch on, that was an interesting one. We wanted to include an element where we could actually use the project to sort of reach out to the community and use it as an educational resource. So where we had sites which had a high profile or were attached to a school project, for instance, then there was natural occurrence where we could actually sort of score at more points for the potential for outreach. One of the other points to really touch on there is the negative impact. So again, coming into this, we were not experts in ground source heat pumps. We weren't sure about the negative impacts which they might cause upon our park, not only in terms of the disturbance of doing it, but also would there be any other negative impacts upon our green spaces. So we were very sort of keen to sort of to look at a way that was going to gauge the negative impact, basically. So whether we had a cricket field, for instance, which would be in popular use, and whether that was going to have a negative impact by taking that out of play. So from that list, we then pulled out 5 sites to particularly look at. So we had Abbey Park Cemetery, Daubney Fields in the centre, which is a sort of a medium-sized local park. We've got London Fields Lido, Clissold Park, which is again a classic sort of Victorian park, and then also the West Reservoir Water Sports Centre, which isn't technically a park, but does fit within our remit of the Leisure and Green Spaces service. So just take you through sort of each of these sites from this feasibility study stage. So London Fields is one of the handful of heated Lidos in London, and this was a project actually which Chris was very excited about, the potential for ground source heat pumps in the first place. And obviously it's got a huge heat demand to keep that large water body at a nice tepid temperature. However, the small print of the RHI, the Renewable Heat Incentive, which is basically a subsidy from the government, states that you can't actually use it to heat outdoor swimming pools. They won't pay out on that. So that was quite frustrating at the time. But again, so that sort of put that out of contention in the short term. Daubney Fields, again, sort of a small park, essentially a small to medium-sized park, but happens to have a primary school right on top of it. Now, as I sort of said, we were quite keen to sort of explore this in terms of the replication potential. I don't know about other authority areas, but certainly with Hackney, we have lots of parks located next to schools, and so there seems to be a real symbiosis there between the potential to heat the schools from the parks. However, the return of income which we were going to get from these sites, from this particular site, wasn't particularly great in terms of the amount of money investment we have to put in terms of the actual physical works on site. So from a parks perspective, in terms of generating an income or saving us money, it wasn't really working for us, because that was sort of the whole ethos of the Rethinking Parks program, was to really explore ways to make parks more financially sustainable. However, from a council-wide perspective, it could still make sense, and so we've bundled up all our information on that and handed it over to our colleagues in the education and property team, because they may want to explore that in the future as another project. Now, CListo, I haven't actually got a slide of, but essentially CListo's house we looked at heating. It's a listed, grade 2 listed mansion house in the park. And although it was looking quite promising, due to the internal wet heating system having to fit within the sort of the listed nature of the site, that was going to be a very expensive internal refit in order to make the system work, because it wasn't really compatible with what we were thinking for the ground source heat pump system. So unfortunately that one got parked as well. Moving on to the West Reservoir Centre. So as I mentioned before, this isn't actually a park site, although we do have aspirations to open up access around the outside of it in the future. Now, I think on this site, there is huge potential. Some of the advantages of it are there's physically no digging, because we can use a water source heat pump, and we can install that underwater without having any implications on the use of the space for sailing or for open swimming, which the site is currently used for. However, at the time, it is managed by our leisure partner, and so the governance relating to that and the income generated from it was not going to be quite as simple as we had hoped, and we weren't certainly going to be able to meet the RHI deadline coming up later next year. So unfortunately, that was parked. However, since then, we have actually installed solar panels on the roof of the system, on the roof of the building, which is obviously going to provide us some energy for the building. So we're going to go back and revisit that in the coming months and see if we can look at that again and get that up and running. Now, Abney Park Cemetery, this is our little sort of success story, which is actually moving forwards. So we initially discounted Abney Park Cemetery because it's a cemetery and underground has a lot of bodies. And so we didn't think there was really going to be any space to actually put any coils into the ground or boreholes. However, from looking at the plans more closely and historical maps, we noted that the area by the entrance, which is paved, has never been disturbed or been used for burials. So we actually do have a small space we could utilise, and this happened to coincide with a lottery-funded project to actually build a cafe on site and an event space. And so these two things sort of naturally dovetail together. So we were able to take that forwards, and that is currently gone through planning, and we're now sort of looking to start work in the coming year. So that's quite a positive. Here's just a sort of brief study of some of the figures from that early feasibility study. As Neil touched on earlier, the thing about heat pumps is although you eliminate the use of gas or reduce the use of gas in some cases, electricity use does tend to go up because you're pumping to use the electricity to power the system. And currently, Hackney pays 5.5 times more for the cost of electricity compared to the units of gas. So it rather makes the business case slightly tricky. However, during all our work, the council committed to doing everything within its power to live in net zero emissions as part of its climate emergency statement. And that has led to the softer benefits, which I suppose were really sort of the focus of our partners over in Possible from their perspective, sort of moving up our agenda as a council. So helping to contribute to net zero, improving air quality, and really sort of helping to protect green space. I suppose that's quite a tricky thing to get your head around, that how does sort of extracting heat from a park actually help protect it. But if you think that you've got the boreholes and you've got the coils underground in a green space, then that becomes a monetized asset, and then you're not going to be able to go in and dig up or build over that green space, because then you're going to impact upon the generating of the heat. So just to conclude and sort of sum up really, that softer benefits have moved up our agenda as a council, and so they are becoming, more important, or certainly just as important as the finance side of stuff. One of the ways to actually move things forward is to incorporate a heat pump technology into new projects. So you're not relying on the business case to get sign off as a single line, but actually by embedding it into a wider project, then it just helps it move forward. It's just aligning the project so it can move forwards. We did get some media coverage from this project, and again, that helped to actually raise the profile internally as well. So we have colleagues from regeneration or housing contacting us. So although we are promoting stuff internally, external media always helps as well. And I suppose fundamentally it's the right thing to do. In many cases, the cost is going to be very similar to gas heating, if not slightly better. And it's just the right thing to do moving forwards. And the councils need to sort of stand up there and do the right thing and show what is possible to inspire other organisations. I suppose the final point is that from a council perspective, when you're writing your business cases, in the future, it may be that carbon will become an element of that business case. And it won't be just a nice to have, it will actually be one of the fundamentals in determining whether a project can go ahead or not. Contact details are on the screen there. If you have any questions, let us know and check out the toolkit.
Thank you very much, Bruce and Neil. We received some questions during the event, which now I'm asking you to answer to. One is more about the cost on the on nature. So someone asked, what is the typical installation time and recovery for the land in case you want to install ground heat pumps? And I think it's more for Neil, this question.
Sure, yeah, no problem. So on the sort of typical installation time, it's a really annoying answer, but it's just it depends. So it's going to depend on the size of the scheme and whether it uses boreholes or whether it's a linear scheme in trenches. But when you contact a installation company for a quote, they'll come along, they'll be able to give you a quote, not only financially, but also how long they would estimate that that would take, and any disruption that would be caused there. The advantage of boreholes is that they occupy less space. So they're going to be less disruptive to your park as a whole, but they're more expensive, and you also need to have good access to the site for the drilling truck to come along and be able to put the borehole in. But ideally, you'd coincide the installation with other works. So if it happens alongside, for example, a drainage work on the grass, or resurfacing playing fields, or building or renovating your facilities like in Hackney Park, then you can minimise a reduction by making sure these things happen at the same time. Other things to note, that it's less disruptive if you install within a body of water. So if that's a concern for your park, but you have a pond, then you can look into water source heat pump system. It's also you could look into installing in a small part of a larger area, so people still have the option of using parts of your park, or if you have a bit of unloved area in the corner of your site, or a brownfield site, which you can then restore and as part of the scheme, so it becomes more of an asset to the community after than before. Yeah, it's generally going to be more difficult if an area is heavily used, or if it has heritage trees or playgrounds or other locally valued assets there. So yeah, it'd be worth prioritizing other low-hanging fruit kind of areas.
Yeah, which is what Bruce and the team has done in Hackney, I guess. And what's the average lifespan of a heat pump before requiring replacement?
Yeah, so a heat pump unit is typically about, they would last at least 20 years, and commonly about up to 25 years. So compared to gas or oil boilers, which are usually 8 to 15 years. So that's quite a favorable comparison. But the buried pipes, like under the ground, they've got a life expectancy of at least 50 years. But a lot of projects are designed on the basis that the lifespan will exceed 100 years. So it's comparable really to gas and water mains infrastructure.
Great, Thank you. And I guess this will be my last question to Bruce. So if you had to give your top tip for a local park manager who is watching you now talking about the project in Hackney, what would that be?
I think, first of all, I'd say go check out our toolkit at poweringparks.wearepossible.org. I think that's probably your first port of call. That's got a lot of sort of frequently asked questions, and it's also got perspectives from, say, if you're a councillor or a parks officer, or even if you're the local community or a park user group. So the idea is it can provide a background and take you through and answer your questions there. I would say also, has your authority declared a climate emergency? And I'll start making friends with the different service areas. So you may not have previously had a natural relationship with your energy team, or so it's probably worthwhile finding out who they are, going along, just having some chats and see if they can support your ideas and see if they've already started exploring this. The other thing is that other sections of the council might also be looking at it. So for instance, the regeneration team or the housing team might well be looking at doing projects in terms of incorporating ground source heat pumps in terms of their new buildings and estate regeneration. So I suppose just, get networking, find out who's leading on sustainability, maybe even nobble your lead member if you have one who's responsible for sustainability, and go that way as well.
Great. Thank you very much for helping me today, and good luck with all the projects, and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Camilla.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for viewing this presentation. For those who aren't familiar with us, Greenspace Scotland is Scotland's parks and greenspace charity. We're a social enterprise, and the main focus of our work is on pioneering new approaches to managing and resourcing green spaces in Scotland. I'm going to talk this morning about specifically about our ParkPower programme, which was originally a Rethinking Parks prototype project, looking at opportunities to generate income from and for our parks through low carbon energy services that green spaces can provide. The kernel of the idea was sown some years ago, back in, as you can see, 2011, when we worked on a pioneer project about climate resilient parks and produced a number of reports looking at the role of green space in climate change mitigation and adaptation. One of the areas that this report covered briefly was the opportunity for parks to host green energy services. And that really was where ParkPower has grown out of. It led directly to work specifically in a site called Saughton Park in Edinburgh, which is managed by the City of Edinburgh Council. And we commissioned a feasibility study looking at how renewable energy could be used in the park. Fast forward a few years, and that led on to the installation, or that has led on to the installation of a ground source heat pump system, and also alongside it, a micro hydro scheme on the Water of Leith that runs along the side of the park. When we look across the UK, there are a small number of park energy projects, and they're mostly using energy within the park. For example, through ground source heat systems, heating park buildings, perhaps some PV solar systems on building roofs. The development has often been driven rather ad hoc and quite opportunistic, often linked to a park renovation project, which is a key trigger point. We started to think about the opportunity for parks in a more strategic way to provide large-scale energy services, not just for the park in this case, but also for areas surrounding the park, including particularly public buildings, social housing, leisure centres, schools and hospitals, all of which have spatial relationships linked directly to green space and are frequently surrounded by areas of green space. With the Scottish Energy Strategy setting a target of 50% of energy across all vectors of heat, transport and electricity from renewable and low carbon sources by 2030, and with many councils declaring climate emergencies, now starting to work on developing their own local heat and energy efficiency services, there was an imperative need to look at this whole area in a very strategic way. We'd already worked with Ordnance Survey to develop the Ordnance Survey greenspace dataset that many of you may already know about. So that meant we knew where all our parks and green spaces actually are. Scottish Government has, over the last few years, worked very hard to produce a heat demand map, which maps down to individual building level where there is demand for heat and which buildings have the most demand. So just bringing these two data sets together, you can start to see where the parks are adjacent to levels of high heat demand. On this basis, we developed a methodology which we've completely shared openly on our website. And this can be used and adapted by any local authority or indeed owner of parks or land. And it can be used to identify the most promising green energy opportunities within parks and green spaces based on this supply side data of knowing where green space sites are and the demand side of knowing where our energy demand is coming from. We've also created a whole suite of other sort of mini products. This is one of our graphics that tells a story of what a typical park might look like when transformed by a ParkPower scheme. Obviously, you wouldn't see a park with all of these things happening at once, but if you imagine this is the sort of things that could happen in and around a typical park. We produced an interactive dashboard, mapping dashboard, that allows anyone interested, particularly this map dashboard covers this whole area of Scotland, and they can explore their own areas of interest and understand the potential that their parks and green spaces, or their playing fields in this case, can offer. And finally, we've also produced a whole range of headline statistics about the potential for parks to provide energy, low carbon energy, and support our climate low carbon energy transition. Just to summarize, about 60% of our parks are in areas that are considered suitable for district heat networks and have the potential to become our largely underground community radiators, supplying heat to our surrounding neighborhoods around parks. And if we only use 20% of the available land within our parks, we could still generate the equivalent of around 50% of heat for 15% of Scotland's households. That's over 380,000 houses, the equivalent of heating every house in Glasgow and Dundee. These figures really show the potential for ground source heat, the ability to generate ground source heat in our parks. We didn't just look at ground source heat, we looked at a whole range of other different technologies as well. But in terms of the most exciting opportunity, certainly ground source heat was the one that shined through in all our analysis. And the results have provoked considerable interest, both in local and national press, and also led to a very successful half-day conference for about 140 attendees in February of this year. Since completing the Rethinking Parks phase of the project, we've also worked on a number of ongoing phases as part of a wider program. So this is an example of we worked with Falkirk and North Lanarkshire councils to explore options in a number of specific park sites. And we've also worked, that work was funded by Local Energy Scotland through their CARES funding. And we've also worked with Glasgow and Edinburgh councils, the latter as part of their Future Parks Accelerator project, to identify a short list of optimal opportunities within both of those council areas for both short-term and long-term projects. Currently, we're working on another spin-off project from under the ParkPower program banner, which we're calling Green Heat in Green Spaces, or GIGS for short. And this is a method, it's reusing the method we developed for parks, but it's actually extending it to all types of green spaces, including amenity grassland, which is much more significant in terms of overall area and will ultimately generate a great deal more potential for heat generation. GIGS is working with more than half of Scottish councils, as well as a wide range of public bodies like NHS Scotland and SEPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in Scotland. And we see outputs from GIGS both informing local energy strategies that are taking place in Scotland at a local level, and also thoroughly underpinning our approaches in general to decarbonising our heat systems. But this isn't just about councils, and with Scottish Government indicating that fossil fuel boilers can no longer be installed in new houses from 2025 onwards, we're also working closely with some housing developers and land developers who are looking at the potential for ParkPower to provide green heat for new homes on sites that are currently being developed or have been earmarked for development. Although we've published a more comprehensive lessons learned document on our website, I just wanted to summarize some key questions and answers on these slides. Many of these have arisen at previous events or at meetings, and I just wanted to pick out a few of these questions. So I don't have time necessarily to go into all the detail about these questions, but they're obviously in the presentation here that you can pause and read, but I'll just pick out a few pertinent points. Why, or should you consider green energy and green spaces as an organisation that may own sites? You certainly should, and you should try and make best use of what have been largely considered underutilised assets. And it will really help specific parks and gain value for these sites, and ultimately in the long term help to protect them. Will these projects help parks or parks departments, as we set out right in our early objective for the Nesta Rethinking Parks project? Will they actually generate revenue? Or specifically, will they generate revenue for parks departments? This is actually much less clear at this stage, and it is very heavily reliant on the current situation with incentives provided largely by the Westminster government. However, it is, and it's also quite reliant on the model adopted by your organisation in terms of how revenue generated by public assets is redistributed in your organisation. There is certainly opportunities to develop revenue streams from these types of projects. There is no doubt about that. Currently, the payback periods are relatively long for many projects, but there are some particular types of projects which we highlighted here that have shorter term payback periods and have clear revenue streams that are potentially quite exciting. So we would really strongly urge you to consider an approach if you are an owner of a portfolio of green space sites and you're looking to maximize the value that they offer your organization. Just picking out another point on this slide, this isn't necessarily about expecting park managers to become energy experts. One of the things that's been critical for both ParkPower and the following up GIGS project has been the need to bring together colleagues across multiple departments to collaboratively deliver multi-phased low carbon energy projects. These projects, I can't stress, need to be driven by a wide range of people with multiple skills and are likely to require you to bring together colleagues from across different departments with those different skills in order to take them forward. So that is definitely the most effective way of taking this process forward. Finally, I just want to leave you with a quote from one of our consultants, Green spaces are islands of energy opportunity amidst a sea of energy demand. I really like that quote, and I think it really sums up the potential that these valuable assets offer organizations that perhaps until now have not necessarily seen them as offering such value, and really potentially have a great deal of untapped value to offer their owners. I hope the presentation has whetted your appetite. You will find out lots more about ParkPower and the GIGS project from our website, which is www.parkpower.org.uk. So please have a look on there. There is lots more things on there, including examples from Scotland, the rest of the UK, and in fact internationally of similar types of projects going on, where you can see operational examples of what people have done and learn lessons from those. Thank you very much.
So hi, I'm Donya Davidson. I'm the Ecologist and Project Development Officer for the Edinburgh Thriving Green Spaces project. We're one of the FPA projects, one of the 8 cities that were fortunate enough to get the FPA funding. And I work for the Scottish Wildlife Trust, but I'm embedded in a team in Edinburgh City Council, and I lead on the ecological work stream. And one of the things I'm developing is Edinburgh's ecological coherence plan, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about now. Oh, there we go. So I thought I'd start off by just talking about what we're doing and why. So we're creating an ecological coherence plan for Edinburgh using something called the Ecological Coherence Protocol. I know that sounds really jargony, but I will explain what all of this means. And the reason that we're doing this is that so we can identify opportunities for nature-based solutions in Edinburgh that maximise ecological benefits, ecosystem services, and socio-economic benefits as well. Now, this protocol has actually already been trialled for a project called the Inner Forest Habitat Network project, and it covered a much larger land area. So multiple council boundaries, a lot more rural and agricultural land. And what we're wanting to do is learn from how they use the protocol, but then adapt it to a city scale and an urban sort of scale in Edinburgh. And the idea is at the end of this, the ECP, or the Ecological Coherence Plan, I'm going to shorten it to ECP from now, will provide us with the evidence to make better informed decisions in the city. And they'll also be a tool for us to prioritise actions and secure and obtain funding. So firstly, I want to explain just a bit about how the whole protocol works. So it is very much a collaborative approach. It's not just me sitting at my desk making decisions. All the logos you see on the screen here are from different stakeholders that have said they want to be involved in the ECP process, which is fantastic. We're going to be working with them over the next few months through a series of workshops, which would have been in person pre-COVID, but are now going to be online. And the ECP has 3 main components, which are habitat networks, ecosystem services, and opportunity areas. And the idea is that when you combine these 3 components together, you identify the best places for interventions to bring benefits to both people and nature. So I'm going to talk through each one of these components and just explain about how it works and how it all ties in together. So firstly, with the habitat network, we started off by collecting data to map the key habitats within Edinburgh. We then categorize these habitats into the broad habitat groups that you're seeing on the right-hand side here. And we wanted to make sure these broad habitat groups align with wider habitat network mapping projects that are going on. So the Inner Forest project that I mentioned recently, that's actually quite close to us geographically, so we wanted to line up with that. And there's other habitat network mapping projects in the Central Belt in Scotland, so we wanted to make sure we align with those too. But we also wanted to make sure we capture enough detail in the habitats that is relevant at an urban scale as well. So we're lining up with the wider ones, but still digging down into that finer scale level of habitat too. We then are going to look at each one of these habitat maps. We've got big maps for these, and we'll go through each one of these with our stakeholder groups that I showed you on the previous slide, and we'll work through those maps to identify opportunities for habitat network development. So doing a bit of blue sky thinking, where would we connect up these habitats if we could connect them anywhere in Edinburgh? And using the practical on-the-ground knowledge of these stakeholders in Edinburgh as well. Next, ecosystem services. We're working with a lady called Gabriella Franco, who is a researcher from the University of Edinburgh, and she's our GIS and ecosystem services specialist. And what we're doing is mapping supply and demand of 7 key ecosystem services in Edinburgh. And we picked these based on their ability to help combat the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency that we're all facing at the moment. And these are air purification, noise regulation, temperature regulation, water purification, flood regulation, health, and by health I mean the direct health benefits from nature, so mental well-being and physical health, and also pollination services. And the maps you see just on the right here, these are actually from Gabriella's master's thesis, because for her master's thesis, she did the whole ecological coherence protocol, but didn't do it for the whole of Edinburgh. So if you know Edinburgh, this map here just comes down to the bypass, and she also didn't do the stakeholder engagement. But it's a really good way to try and explain and show you what we're doing with the ecosystem services. And we're currently doing the analysis. I don't have any final maps to share at this point. So this is air purification as an example. And what we have over here is what we're calling air purification demand. So areas in the city where there's high levels of air pollution that are requiring an air purification service. So these, you can see quite easily, these are like busy roads and densely populated areas in the city. And then on the left-hand side, we have what we call air purification capacity or air purification supply. So what Gabriella can do is she can categorize different types of vegetation based on their abilities to pull pollutants from the air. So that's what you're seeing in the green areas, or areas of the city that are providing this air purification service. Then on the bottom map, we've overlaid both the supply and demand, and you can really clearly see parts of the city where there's demand, no supply, supply, no demand. And these dark green areas here are where supply and demand are being met. So what you might draw from this is that these are really important areas, we need to protect those, they're providing essential services, or if you're going to redevelop those, you have to make sure that they're still retaining their ability to provide the service as it's so necessary. So we will have one of these maps, a supply and demand map, for each one of these ecosystem services, and then we'll work through them with our stakeholder group and try and identify the areas of demand in the city and think of opportunities to provide ecosystem services. Then finally, for opportunity areas, these are the practical on-the-ground opportunities. So for the habitat network, it was some blue sky thinking. It's ecologically, where should we connect up these habitats in the city? With ecosystem services, it's looking at the supply and demand from the analysis. And then we're overlaying this with areas in the city that we can actually do things in, we can actually make interventions. So these are just a few examples that I've put, but there's a lot more than these. It could be on stakeholder-owned land, so it could be in council parks and green spaces. It could also be in future housing development sites. So we've been working quite closely with the housing team, and they've said, please put any future development sites into your plan and try and identify opportunities within those. It could be Scottish Wildlife Trust reserves, also NHS sites, because we've been working with the NHS as part of the health ecosystem service analysis. And it might also be opportunities to engage with new landowners. So even residents of private gardens, also the Ministry of Defence in Edinburgh have a large land holding. So it could be these opportunities too. We'll then go into our final workshops with the stakeholders, and we will overlay the habitat network, the ecosystem services, and then these opportunity areas, and try and identify what these practical opportunities are. So the idea is that when we combine, sorry, that's the word I'm looking for, when we combine these three components, we'll come up with a map that essentially has a series of opportunities that are single site interventions that have multiple benefits for both people and nature. And this is just a map that I mocked up. This is not a final output. I hope we have more than 5 opportunities, but it's just to give you an idea of what the final output could look like. And each one of these, yep, will be a single site intervention, but it won't just be for the habitat network. It will also be habitat network, but it could provide health benefits for people in the city where they need it, or flood regulation, or whatever it might be. Finally, I just wanted to touch on where the ECP fits into wider strategies for Edinburgh and how we're hoping to deliver it as well. So I see the ECP having 2 main delivery arms. One through our local development plan and into something we have called the Green-Blue Network in Edinburgh. It's currently being developed, and the ECP is going to fit into that, but it's also going to come that way if we embed it in the framework. And that would be embedded in the planning work. It will be able to influence future development of the city and help us to make better informed decisions when developing the city as well. The other arm is more a conservation enhancement arm, not linked to development. And we have something called Edinburgh's Living Landscapes, which is a partnership initiative that currently delivers several projects across Edinburgh that bring benefits for wildlife and nature. And the idea is that the ECP will help us build the case for funding, because it's not just about one aspect. It's you can look at health, you can look at climate resilience, you can tie it into so many different things. And so help us build that case for funding. We can then deliver it through the Edinburgh's Living Landscape. And it can also help us guide outputs from our Thriving Green Spaces strategy. So the overall project is developing a 30-year strategy and vision for Edinburgh. So we're hoping to embed it into there as well. So that's everything from me. Thank you so much for listening to this. If you have any questions or want to know any more about what I'm doing, then please drop me an email. My email's here, and I'm more than happy to help answer them.